From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is a special edition of Set for Sentencing. What is Set for Sentencing? It's a brand new podcast that hasn't officially launched yet. It launches at the end of the month. And the first official episode, FYI, is going to be amazing. It's already in the can. It features Dr. Liz Vartkesian. I don't know if you know Dr. Liz, Mark, but she runs this amazing organization called Advancing Real Change, and it is one of the nation's, maybe the nation's premier sentencing mitigation organizations. They do sentencing mitigation and death penalty and non-capital cases. So for all you listeners, that's just a little plug. I want you to check it out. I want you to subscribe to the podcast. The original web broadcast we did together, Mark, is up there so people can start subscribing on all the major platforms. Check out Set for Sentencing. Just so when we start releasing these episodes every week, everybody can start drinking from the sentencing fire hose that we are about to turn the nozzle on as fast as possible. But some topics are just too timely to wait for the official release. So we did this together, Mark Allenbaugh, during the KBJ confirmation hearings. And that's the one that's on YouTube and all the major podcast platforms. But today is another one of those can't wait moment. So, helping us get set for sentencing again, the incomparable Mark Allenbaugh. He is here today to talk about the current state of federal compassionate release. People think it's dead. It's not, but it's riddled with flat-out wrong arguments and wrong data and false information. So we're going to set the record straight with Mark Allenbaugh, a legal genius, a statistics wizard, a guy with an encyclopedic knowledge of all things sentencing guidelines and BOP and COVID and now fucking monkeypox. Welcome, Mark Allenbaugh. Good to have you back, man. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Doug. I appreciate it. This is a timely topic.
Well, so there's got to be a few people listening who are going like, okay, this may be interesting, but what the hell is compassionate release? So give me a quick overview, quick intro. What is compassionate release? And maybe tell us, how it kind of evolved after the First Step Act passed back in 2018.
So compassionate release is basically a legal vehicle for a court to look at a defendant's sentence and determine whether or not to lessen that sentence. It's, if you will, it's a form of clemency that Congress originally gave the Bureau of Prisons to do rather than just courts. And this has been an aspect of this has been within the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines, since the beginning, since back in 1986 when the guidelines were first promulgated. But it's been rarely used. And originally it was designed for if an inmate had served a really long time in prison and was elderly now, or was very sick and had maybe like 6 months to live. It allowed a court it was like the ultimate safety valve, just short of clemency, where clemency, as we know, is going to the president of the United States and he would grant it. So this allowed courts basically a second look, but it was rarely utilized.
Yeah, and the timing was sort of impeccable because I think it passed in 2018, and then of course 2019 comes along, COVID hits,
Right.
and compassionate release became really just kind of exploded because people are stuck in this festering, you call it a nuclear reactor for COVID inside these BOP facilities.
Right.
So all these inmates are starting to use the First Step Act to get more compassionate release motions. So but here's the problem that, there's always resistance to it because people don't want to let prisoners out early, even though the First Step Act was designed to help facilitate that. But we're going to go down the line because I think,
Doug, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but not just the First Step Act was designed for that. The original Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which created the commission, which created the guidelines, was designed for that as well. It's just the commission kind of ignored that, as well as the Bureau of Prisons ignored that provision. For the lawyers out there, it's 18 USC 3582 little t like Tom. Take a look at that provision. That's been in there since 1986.
Well, and I think maybe that's the first sort of pushback argument that, the people who are opposed to letting folks, get out early for these legitimate reasons say that these compassionate release motions undermine the United States sentencing guidelines. The guidelines set this is how long you're supposed to be doing your time, and if you release them early, then it undermines the guidelines. But what I'm hearing you saying is, how does it undermine the guidelines when it's been in the guidelines since its inception?
Correct. It's fundamental to and part of the guidelines. It has always been there. And within the guidelines specifically, there is a provision 1B1.13 that specifically references the compassionate release statute, which is 3582 sub C. And by the way, I misspoke earlier when I said 18 USC 3582 sub T. I meant 28 USC 3582 sub T. That's where you would look. And then 18 USC 3582 sub C is the actual compassionate release sentencing guideline for all those that want to get technical with it. But the point simply is this: compassionate release has always been part of the guidelines. It's rarely been utilized for whatever reason. It's been ignored. And Congress always intended that compassionate release to be more frequently used than it has been.
And that First Step Act, which is 2018, is a bipartisan bill. So this is not a political thing. People on both sides of the aisle are looking at this compassionate release provision that's been in existence since the inception of the guidelines and saying, we are not doing this enough. We need to do this more. So anybody out there who's thinking, who's got someone on the other side saying this is somehow anathema to the original intent of the guidelines, forget it. It's not true.
It's not true.
Down. All right, good. So that's a good place to start now.
Right. So I'm sorry, Doug. Just one quick thing to tie a bow on that. So what the First Step Act did, what really changed compassionate release, is before the First Step Act, the Bureau of Prisons, the warden at your prison, had to move for your compassionate release. And that was happening like less than a dozen times a year out of thousands and thousands of requests from inmates. Now, what the First Step Act allowed is for inmates to seek compassionate release directly from courts. All they have to do is first they have to ask the warden, and the warden has 30 days whether to grant it or ignore it or deny it. And after 30 days, if it hasn't been granted, then they can go to court, inmates directly. And so now compassionate release has been granted quite a bit relative to what happened prior to the First Step Act. It's really open.
I just want to emphasize what you just said, because what we see often is an inmate will file this request with the warden, and the warden just sits on it. They don't flat out deny it. They just don't get an answer. But this is pretty awesome because it says, look, if you don't hear from 30 days, you get to go to court and let a judge decide.
Correct.
That's a big deal. Yes. Are there any other good changes that expanded or changed the compassionate release after the First Step Act?
Well, nothing really expanded compassionate release, but there was a little bit of a quirk. What happened was that when the First Step Act passed, and until now, there has not been a quorum at the commission. So the commission has not been able to update the guidelines to account for the First Step Act. So there's this provision I spoke about previously, 1B1.13. every circuit except one, every circuit has said that provision does not apply anymore, or is not mandatory on courts when they're considering compassionate release. And what that provision said was there's basically only two reasons why you should grant compassionate release. One is age, and other is health. But what happened was, because the commission did not have a quorum at the time the First Step Act passed, many courts at every circuit except one, and I'll get to that in a second, but every circuit except one said, well, this provision 1B 1.13 in the guidelines no longer is applicable because that applied to pre-First Step Act law. Now we have this new law, so 1B 1.3 is irrelevant. So what that means is judges can consider anything for terms of as qualifying for compassionate release. It's not just the age of the defendant or his or her health conditions. It could be other things too, like the changes in sentencing law, the pandemic, COVID-19, all this other stuff. Now, the only circuit, by the way, that has gone the other way is the 11th Circuit, in a case called the United States versus Bryant. That went up on a petition of cert to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court denied cert. So the 11th Circuit is just sitting out there kind of flailing until the commission comes in and once it gets quorum, which should happen soon, to address that circuit split.
Okay, so this is interesting to me because first it was age and health. Now you're saying anything.
Anything.
And one of the things that we have, so full disclosure, Mark and I do work together, and we've done a ton of these compassionate release, Mark more than I. But one of the issues that I see, once we dig in, we get the sentencing record and we kind of get a big picture of what happened originally at sentencing. And there are these things called second look arguments, which basically one of the arguments is it's not about health, it's not about age, it's about this guy got a raw deal at sentencing. Either he had terrible representation, or the law significantly changed, or there's something that requires us to kind of go back and look at, was this a fair sentence at the beginning? You're saying those are allowed under compassionate release motions?
Yes, those are allowed under compassionate release motions, essentially a second look. Everywhere outside of the 11th Circuit. Now, sometimes they don't fly, and that's not to say that these are automatic, but they are not precluded per se. And any argument can be made. Family circumstances, for example, if you're the only person available now to take care of a dying parent or children or something of that matter, those have been considered and sometimes granted for compassionate release. Go ahead.
You know, not to get too geeked out on the law, but this is kind of interesting because was it yesterday or the day before the Supreme Court came out with this horrible ruling about habeas petitions, which is essentially where you get into federal court to examine what went wrong in your conviction or your trial. And they substantially limited the a defendant's right to have an evidentiary hearing and explore these issues in federal court. And Justice Thomas said that's because we have this interest in finality, that we don't want to go back and look at these other, we don't want to relitigate the past. It is what it is, and too bad for you, essentially. Yeah. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there because I'm worried at the end of the day if that sort of foreshadows limitations that are going to come on compassionate release.
Well,
it's very speculative. It just came to mind.
Right. No, and that's a good, valid point, but it misunderstands compassionate release. Compassionate release isn't, even though the government will often frame it this way, is not a second look of the facts as they were at sentencing. It's a new look about the facts now. What is going on now? What is, and I mean, this, for example, age. I mean, let's just go back to the original point of compassionate release. It was age and medical issues. Well, those didn't exist at the time of a defendant that a defendant was serving or was sentenced. So now these circumstances change. So that's the whole point. Is compassionate release is where there's been a significant change in circumstances, and the term of art or the phrase of art is extraordinary and compelling circumstances. Are there extraordinary and compelling circumstances that would warrant someone to get either a lower sentence or to be released immediately? And again, traditionally those were age and health, but now they could be anything outside of the 11th Circuit. And so this is where it blew up with COVID. Now we have this, this novel coronavirus spreading through and all the damage.
That's a perfect segue into the second misconception, that people are basically saying, yeah, there was a good reason for releasing people during COVID. People were getting sick. People could die, blah, blah, blah. But that's all behind us now. The pandemic's over. Let's get back to normal.
Well, if you look, we're, depending on who you ask, we're either in the fourth or the fifth wave of the pandemic. Every time the pandemic has dipped, there's always been this argument. You could see it in the published opinions. It's over. And so there's no more extraordinary, compelling reasons. It's not over. We're going to go through this again. And as a matter of fact, right now, it's on the uptick. Cases are on the uptick. Hospitalizations, again, are on the uptick. And there's new variants. There are new variants all the time. So, one of the things that it's very important for counsel to recognize when they're bringing a compassionate release case is very often the government's going to oppose based upon law that may have been decided or issued a year ago or 2 years ago. That was a different time. Those were different variants of the virus. Now it's completely different. So, I'm sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No.
Okay. So I
was nodding my head in agreement.
Okay.
Showing you I'm here with you. Yes, sir.
Right. So if you look at cases out of 2000, that was pre-Delta variant. And so how courts analyzed in the data that was available to them back then is completely different than back in 2001 or the summer of 2001 when we started getting the Delta variant. And then the vaccines were all of a sudden came on the scene. And everybody at the time thought the vaccines were going to be the end all be all. Like you get vaccinated one time and you don't have to worry about ever getting infected or getting sick from COVID again. It was kind of like a measles vaccine or a chicken pox vaccine or something like that. But it turns out that was the case.
Let's dig in because I'm hearing this. That may be the most frequent reason that we get shot down in court. The judge wants to know, has your client been vaccinated? And has he been double vaxxed? And has he been boosted? And basically, once the court learns that the inmate or the client has been vaccinated, that has the potential to sort of shut it down. And so what's going wrong with that argument?
Well, what's going wrong with that argument is basically two things. One is timing, and the other is, it's both two aspects of timing. When was the inmate vaccinated? And how many vaccines did the inmate receive? Now, the BOP on its page reports how many inmates are fully vaccinated, but it has a big disclaimer in bold that states this does not include inmates that have received a booster shot. As we all know now that we didn't know back in 2020 and 2021, is that 2 shots is not enough. You need a booster. And as a matter of fact, 1 booster isn't enough if you're over 50. You need 2 boosters now. Well, when was the inmate vaccinated? And how long ago? And as you can't just go off of 2 shots anymore. So this is very important for the court to know and understand is this inmate in fact fully vaccinated? Just because he or she received 2 doesn't mean that he's fully vaccinated. Even if this inmate received 4, doesn't mean he's fully vaccinated, because the other thing we've learned is that the vaccines wane in efficacy. There are many studies, very easy to find online. And I'm not talking peer-reviewed articles. I'm talking actually peer-reviewed, published in the New England Journal of Medicine and other prestigious journals like that, where they show scientifically that even after 4 doses of the vaccine, it's only effective for maybe 4 to 10 weeks max. So even if the inmate is fully vaccinated, the question still is when. So it's really how much has the inmate been vaccinated? When was the inmate vaccinated? And more importantly, now what's spreading? Was the inmate vaccinated during the time of Delta? Was the inmate vaccinated when Omicron just came out? What kind of vaccine is the inmate receiving now? Because we're past Omicron. we're into BA1, we're into BA2. As a matter of fact, BA2 is starting to go down. We have BA3 and BA4 and BA5, and now monkeypox that we'll talk about a little bit later. But the point simply is the COVID, or really SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is evolving so quickly in so many variants that not only can science not keep up, but certainly the law can't keep up. So all these citations that the government makes in opposing compassionate release, if they're older than 3-4 weeks, then they're irrelevant, because that's based upon old data, old science.
Science can't keep up, the law can't keep up, and the bureaucracy of the BOP certainly can't keep up.
Absolutely not.
So here's another, bat you down, poo-poo this whole, pandemic, this little pandemic problem that we're having. The judges look at whether the inmates had coronavirus, has had COVID, and recovered, and somehow that's a reason to deny these compassionate release. Right. What's the problem there?
Well, the same problem, and again, I'm not an expert epidemiologist. I'm just the numbers guy. Yeah, any attorney can go out there and Google this for him or herself. But there are many, many peer-reviewed scientific studies that show that just because one has been infected with a prior variant and recovered there is no evidence that it provides any ongoing immunity to new variants, let alone what they were infected with. There's this little thing that we're starting to learn more and more about called long COVID. So when somebody gets infected, they might be symptomatic for a few weeks and then those symptoms go away. That doesn't mean they're no longer infected. What we're starting to see now in the scientific literature, there's a plethora of it out there, is that not just inmates, but anybody that's been infected can continue to have long-term damage to their organs, to their brain, to their pancreas. We're seeing increases in diabetes, type 2 diabetes, because what's happening is long COVID is circulating in there and attacking the pancreas, which creates the insulin. Without insulin, you get diabetes. And it's causing all sorts of other long-term damage to organs in the body. So the point simply is, just because somebody is infected, has been infected in the past, and has recovered from their initial symptoms, does not mean that they are fully recovered. It does not mean that they're not going to continue having long-term damage, and certainly does not mean that they're going to be immune from future iterations of this virus that is evolving. There's a new iteration of it almost every 2 or 3 days that we know of.
I love the idea. Well, it's ironic that the word compassion is right there in the title. Yeah. But what people don't realize is the truth of what it has to be like to be incarcerated during COVID. We know just from our own lives out in the free world with access to medical care and, food, whatever we need, that COVID destroyed our mental health and our communities and our economy. But now think about what it means to be in prison. And you say, well, he already had COVID in prison. Yeah, he already had COVID in prison. That in and of itself should be worthy of some compassion. But then the fact that they're still having to live with long COVID in a system that didn't give proper medical care before the pandemic, and is famous for it. I mean, Google it. There's IG reports, and it's famous. So this is every day is punishment beyond comprehension, which was never contemplated during the original sentence. That we knew you were going to do some time, but we didn't know you were going to do this kind of time. Right. So in my opinion, I don't know if I'll find a judge out there that agrees with me, but if you want to be truthful about compassion, that long COVID is a big part of that. Something they're carrying with them every day. So and it makes inmates, even because of that long COVID, it's affecting their immune systems. That makes them more vulnerable, not only to new iterations of SARS-CoV-2, but to other infectious diseases like monkeypox or the measles or anything else that might be circulating within, or just even the flu that might be circulating within a prison. I can tell you're chomping at the bit to get us to monkeypox, but we're not ready. Well, not yet. I got one more. But I know. And by the way, one of the things that Mark is famous for are his really colorful, very expressive charts. And we haven't done a screen share yet. And of course, if you're just going to listen to this podcast, you may want to bop over to the YouTubes to get the visual. But I just want to make sure that I didn't miss out on anything, because have you had any charts or anything to share with us up to this point, or we just haven't gotten there yet?
Oh, no, I have some charts.
Yay!
Let me just get them ready here. 1 second.
Visual aids are always nice.
Okay, we could
do a little song and sing a song while you get.
Okay, let's go ahead. Yeah,
share the screen.
Go ahead and share the screen.
All right, I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. No, you share the screen. Can you?
I share the screen. Yes, I can.
Authorize you to do that.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So I am sharing the screen here. There we go. Okay, so one thing that one of the big things that we're seeing right now with compassionate release denials is the and by the way, I'm getting a bit of an echo.
I just clicked on my Facebook to make sure these charts were looking good online. Sorry.
Okay.
They are, by the way, they're looking
good.
Very, very lovely.
Good. So one of the big factors that go into denials of compassionate release is that courts are looking at what the BOP is publishing every day in terms of how many active infections there are at a particular institution. Mm-hmm. And the problem with that is right now they're showing there are very, very few active infections. And let me show you a chart here and get it for you. And so here, what you can see, this basically shows, I'm comparing the number of inmates that are in BOP custody, and this includes those that are in home confinement or on RRC, basically halfway house here in the blue. But what I want you to focus on are these orange lines here. And what these orange lines indicate, these are how many active infections there were on any given day. And you can see we've gone through 4 big spikes. This last big spike was Omicron. And that's inclusive not only of inmates in BOP facilities, but inmates in private facilities as well as staff that the BOP has reported. And as you can see, as of now, here in mid-May, there are very few. As of May 20th, there was only 345 total active infections reported by the BOP in terms of staff and inmates. But here is the clincher.
Wait a minute. Just before you get to that, because I'm trying to wrap my mind around the 11,265 active infections is just 2-3 months ago. But we've supposedly been out of the pandemic for quite some time. So you're telling me the highest infection rates, the most recent stat there is from the highest infection rates is just like February of this year?
January 24th.
Wow.
There was 11,265 total active infections.
Okay, and that drops off to zero in almost not zero, but drops off to the cliff. So what? Okay,
it drops off within 2 months. It drops down to 298 active infections.
Okay, so that's because the BOP is so wonderful at treating COVID and doing everything properly.
Yes, apparently the BOP has some magic elixir that they're spraying among the inmates to do this. But
it's pixie dust.
Yes, the pixie dust.
Okay, what's the deal with the drop off then?
Okay, here's the deal with the drop off. This shows. Let me increase the size of this a little bit here. This shows the pending tests on any given day within the BOP as the BOP reports it. You can see early in the pandemic, going all the way back to June of 2020, the BOP was testing like crazy, constantly. And then all of a sudden, around the beginning of 2021, they slowly start dropping off.
Wait a minute. Is this the Trump pandemic response plan that if we just stop testing for coronavirus, it'll go away?
Bingo.
Is that what you're telling me?
Bingo. And actually, it's hard to see here, but since February 16th of this year, the BOP has consistently reported exactly 136 pending tests every single day. That's impossible. They've had exactly 136 pending tests every single day. That they have never before February 16th of this year, they never had more than 3 consecutive days of the same pending test. What this indicates to me is they are not testing. Wow. There is no testing going on at any of these facilities. Now you can verify this by going to the BOP website, and you can actually track by individual facility how many tests that they were doing at any particular facility. Now, I'm sure they're doing tests. The problem is they are not reporting them. But the bigger problem is that's always been with the BOP. They are not doing randomized testing of inmates within the facility. So they really have no idea how far it's spread. So why does the BOP ever test anybody if they're not doing randomized tests? Last August, the CDC itself was alerted to a big outbreak at FCI Texarkana, and they went there to find out what the hell was going on. By the way, at the time at FCI Texarkana, over 80% of the inmates were fully vaccinated, and yet they had a massive outbreak. So what happened?
By the way, if for those of you who can't see us, Mark is saying fully vaccinated in air quotes.
In air quotes, yes.
That means they got their 2 shots but never boosted is what I hear you saying. Okay.
Right.
Yes.
But even if they had been fully boosted, I mean, this is the other thing that the CDC was so interested in is why are infections exploding when everybody's been vaccinated, fully or otherwise? What they found out is there was no testing going on. When they would test an inmate, they would only test an inmate if the inmate self-reported. And this was in the CDC, the report itself. They said inmates there was no randomized testing. The BOP was exclusively relying on inmates to self-report, and the inmates had a huge disincentive to self-report. Why? Because once you self-report that, hey, I'm sick, I have COVID, you go into the SHU, to the special housing unit, into solitary confinement, and you lose all sorts of privileges. You don't get any more visitation. Your phone privileges are extremely limited. Most likely, you're not going to have any library privileges. You're going to be stuck in solitary with, if you're lucky, maybe one other person, but most likely by yourself for the next 2 weeks. Nobody wants that. So nobody was self-reporting unless they were deathly ill. And that was the only time that the BOP was seeing this, was receiving this. Inmates have learned that now. They're not self-reporting. They are hiding. Understandably so. They are hiding from the BOP when they are ill, and because they don't want to go into in a solitary confinement. But what happens? They continue to spread it, and the infection continues to evolve in them. Now, you might think I'm speculating, but I want to show you something here that I've been tracking as well. And this is, let me get it here 1 second. I'm sorry, just bear with me 1 second to get this. There's some of these others I want to, oh, here it is. So these are the total active cases within the BOP. That's spread out that's differentiated by inmates and active staff. And what you can see is at times, there were more staff that were infected than inmates. I mean, that should just give you pause, if nothing else, because staff ostensibly have more prophylactic measures of protection against getting infected than inmates do, because the staff are not living within a closed community like inmates are. They're ostensibly provided better masking materials, and they should be tested every day when they're coming in and what have you. And the inmates aren't. So this should give people pause. But what's going on right now, and I haven't updated this in the last couple of days, but the number of staff infections are now growing again faster than inmate infections. And that is incredibly problematic. Again, because frankly, that shouldn't happen when you have so many more inmates, just number wise and in density, than staff. if there's going to be any infectious outbreak, it should be almost always more inmates.
Is that then just more proof that that's not true, that the inmate infections probably far outnumber
exactly
infections, but they're just not testing for it?
Correct. They're not testing for it. And the active number of infections that they're reporting is just baseless. It's meaningless. Just like the active number of vaccines. They report the number of inmates that have been vaccinated, but as they say in the disclaimer, as I mentioned before, they don't include the number who have been boosted. So it's a meaningless number too. So my point simply is this, is if courts are relying on, and if the government is arguing that, look, Judge, there are no infections here, or very few infections here, there's nothing to worry about, that is wrong. That is absolutely baseless and unscientific data to make any inference off of. It's meaningless. It's crap. Garbage in, garbage out.
And so, let me get this. Let me make sure I get the why of this right, and the argument about why this is happening, because you focus on the fact that BOP is only going to test if an inmate self-reports, and inmates don't want to self-report because if they test positive, it's horrible for them.
Correct.
But there seems to me, this may be my conspiracy hat on, but this uniform number of 136 every day, we're doing 136 tests.
Right.
Like, it seems to me like they're fudging the numbers too. Like, how do you think that there's something else going on that BOP wants to portray to the world that this is dealt with? Or is it just a function of prisoners don't want to test?
What I personally think it's a reflection of is something called Hanlon's razor. It's a formulation of Occam's razor. Never ascribe to nefarious reasons or a conspiracy what can be explained by incompetence. I think just the BOP is completely.
But it's fun to do conspiracy theories.
Yes,
I mean, come on.
It's fun, but what I think, and there are many. Look, the BOP is completely dysfunctional right now. They just lost the director from the director of the BOP. I think one of the assistant directors too. There are several BOP wardens under indictment throughout the United States, as well as corrections officers. The place is the BOP is just a big dysfunctional mess right now. It was kind of like that before COVID, but now it's gotten so much worse. Now, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention is, you know who has an incentive to report in sick? Corrections officers.
Yeah,
they don't have to go to work.
Yeah.
So, and what happened? Right. They get paid time off. And so what's happening to this, again, all of this is easily verifiable, is that many of the BOP facilities now are woefully understaffed. If you don't have enough staff just to do the rounds and keep the lights on, you're certainly not going to have enough staff to do testing and to manage outbreaks of an infectious disease and to collect data and to report that data on time. I mean, it's basically as simple as that.
All right. Well, this is why I love Mark, because he's the sobering yin to my raging yang in terms of, so I put out a conspiracy theory and he's going to tamp that down, which I appreciate. But I still can't get over this uniform number of 136. That's either a remarkable coincidence or a BOP policy that we're going to give exactly 136 tests a day, or it's some schlub who knows he's got to put a number in and they're too lazy to think of a different number, so they just do 136 every day. But
that's pretty much it. I think it's that, frankly.
Okay, but to me that's criminal. You're false reporting numbers. Is maybe the number zero, maybe the number's more. I don't know. But if we can't rely on the BOP website that's supposed to be accurately reporting data, then how do we rely on anything?
Right. Exactly. So that's, I mean, ultimately that's the point I'm trying to make here is that the BOP website, if it ever meaningfully reported data, it certainly no longer does. There is no way to rely on this data in terms of the number of infections, the number of vaccinated inmates. And it's, I'm not even sure if it's reporting the number of inmate deaths correctly. But the number of inmate deaths it has reported, excuse my French, should shock the shit out of everybody. Yeah. And here's why. As of last Friday, there have been at least 295 reported inmate deaths from COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic, so just over 2 years. In an 18-year period, in 18 years, from 2001 through 2018, there were only a total of 102 deaths within the BOP nationwide by accident. In that same 18-year period, there was only 182 by homicide. In that same 18,
only 182 murders in the BOP.
And only 182 murders, yes, in 18 years. So about 10 a year.
Yeah.
And then in AIDS, another infectious disease, there were only 167 deaths. That's in over 18 years. There have been 295 in just 2 years. This is, as far as I'm aware.
2 years, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in just 2 years. As far as I'm aware, COVID-19 is the highest single source cause of death in the history of the Bureau of Prisons. And I'm sure this number is not correct. I'm sure this number is higher. But that's just going off of what they're reporting so far. And by the way, that does not include 18 inmate deaths in private facilities and 7 staff deaths.
So this is I think this is one of the biggest takeaways, if not the biggest takeaway, because when we do compassionate release, the other side, our esteemed adversaries, go right to the website and go to these statistics and say, no problem, no worries. And what you're telling us here is trust nothing with regards to the statistics that are posted on the BOP website, which is a good, okay, so that's scary and sad and outrageous. But keep that in mind. Trust nothing. These garbage in, garbage out. Whatever the BOP is reporting is junk. And every single lawyer needs to understand that and tell that story when we're doing compassionate release. This, to me, suggests the other ongoing saga with the BOP, which is, don't worry, we got this. And you've seen this, we've seen this time and time again, even before COVID, where we have a client who is about to go face sentencing and they're sick. They have some kind of illness. Maybe they have cancer, maybe they have whatever. And the BOP does this form letter and they say, don't worry, we got this. That's the moral of the story. We have health care, we have services, we have facilities, we have staff, we can take care of this. And we've always known that is absolute garbage. And some of our clients have paid that price with their lives.
Yeah.
Because they don't got this. But this story that they're telling with the statistics on their website with COVID is we got this, but they're also telling sort of the other anecdotal story, which is we got this, don't worry, we're doing everything right. We're taking all the precautions. We're protecting these inmates from COVID. Is that a true story that they're telling?
No. And again, easily verifiable. One of the big things that they could be doing, that they should have been doing from the outset, is randomized testing. They're not doing that. So they have no idea how widespread any infectious disease is, whether it's COVID or the measles or monkeypox or something else. The other thing that they're not doing, and this is something that we've all come to learn, masks. They're not providing actual masks that will prevent infection or could the best masks out there that could prevent infection, KN95s and N95s. They're not providing those to inmates. And that's CDC standards. Again, easily verifiable, go on the CDC website. Instead, what they're providing in a very haphazard fashion and very infrequently are cloth masks. The CDC itself says cloth masks are useless. Cloth masks are useless to prevent use from spreading the infection or to protect you from receiving it. That's why they keep saying KN95s or N95s. And this is especially important in a prison facility where you literally cannot engage in social distancing. So they're not doing that as well. The other thing that they're not doing is transferring inmates to home confinement. As we started out our discussion about the whole purpose of compassionate release, in the last almost 40 years since the guidelines were conceived, we know that compassionate release existed. But there was a big criticism of the BOP that it was never seeking compassionate release, or very rarely, like a dozen times a year out of the 100,000+ inmates that there might be in throughout the BOP facilities nationwide. they were only seeking compassionate release maybe a dozen times a year. That hasn't changed. Now that
And by the way,
Yeah.
sorry, and I think, getting someone out into home confinement isn't just about protecting that individual. It's about lowering the prison population. Ostensibly, the more people you can get out of there, the more you can kind of spread out the population, do social distancing and all that. So how's that working out?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not the BOP right now. If you are you still sharing my screen?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Oh, you are. Yeah.
Okay.
You want to get rid of that?
No. 1 sec. Go through all my junk here. I want to show everybody something. I've been tracking the percentage of. This might be a little.
These may be the one stats that BOP publishes that are accurate, which is their population.
Yes,
and
this is
what we call their rated capacity, right?
Correct.
All right. Tell me about it.
Okay, so as of May 19th, out of 192 BOP facilities, 90 of them were over their rated capacity, meaning that they were over 100% of the rated capacity. They had more inmates in them than there should be there. And we are in a pandemic. Maybe that's normal in normal times, but we are in a pandemic. Here's the big problem. Back in July of 2020, the average inmate capacity, the average institution was at 94.3% capacity. Now it's averaging over 101%. The BOP's facilities are getting more packed throughout this pandemic, which is making it worse, which you think would give the BOP even more incentive to start transferring inmates to home confinement or to RRCs.
I don't think your charts are the ones you were referring to. I'm still seeing the deaths caused in there. But while you pull those charts, you maybe unshare and reshare screen.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. But I think that, and this is speculation, but, during the height of the pandemic, things kind of slowed down in terms of the court functioning. So sentencings were continued, prosecutions were down, indictments were down. So I have to imagine that had some effect on the prison population. But now, we seem to be revving up back to normal, back to full speed. So that may be why we're seeing this huge uptick in the population. But what lawyers need to know who are going to sentencing right now, and we're not just talking about people who are in jail, in custody in the BOP, who are trying to get out on compassionate release. We are telling you that when you go in for your sentencing hearing, that you need to be making these arguments about what they're running into, what shitstorm they're about to run into at the BOP with regards to the COVID and their exposure in their prison population, particularly if your client already has those medical vulnerabilities, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So here's, can you see this now, Doug? Inmate population trend? Okay. So what every gray line represents is all 192 facilities and how they have tracked in terms of their percent of their rated capacity since July of 2020. And what this red line here indicates is that that's the 100% capacity. So any line above that indicates that that facility is above its rated capacity, and lines below that below its rated capacity.
Wow.
This yellowish orangish line is the average. And as we could see, as I was explaining, is it started out in July of 2020 at 94.3%, which was still pretty high. But now it has grown throughout the course of the pandemic, and the pandemic has gotten worse. And it keeps growing. I mean, we keep having these waves. It goes up and down, and every wave keeps growing and growing and growing. And so now we're at 101, and we're averaging the average facility is at 101.6% of its rated capacity. And obviously that means the more inmates in a particular facility, the greater likelihood of transmission and more problematically evolution or mutation of the virus. Yeah.
What is that, just out of curiosity, the crazy gray line that's off the charts at 50%?
Oh, yeah. Yes. That is the Terre Haute, the camp at Terre Haute.
Wow.
And it's at 354% of its rated capacity.
Wow. And this is really important stuff because, a lot of well, hopefully not a lot, but some lawyers don't understand the value of a sentencing recommendation, a BOP recommendation for where to serve their sentence. And most of the time, the default is, well, keep them close to home. Well, if FCI Terre Haute is close to home, I would want to know that they're 350% over the rated capacity for any number of reasons, not just because of COVID, but these are really important stuff. I guess what I'm doing is plugging you and your services because we routinely use these experts like you and Maureen Baird, who is a BOP, has been a former warden. They can give the judge such a deeper perspective on what the reality of a prison sentence is going to mean for our clients. So we got to look at these stats. Mm-hmm. We got to consult these experts, and we got to be aware of all these moving pieces there. So that's an aside, I know. But what I think the takeaway is, if a prison is overcrowded, because rated capacity is a fancy word for bursting at the seams, then that is what you might call a nuclear reactor for COVID virus. Right? Yeah. Pack people in like sardines in close proximity without proper masks, oftentimes ventilation, whatever it may be, hygiene, and you're asking for trouble, period.
Right, exactly. And let's just look at real quick how it's growing here. So let me just increase the screen here. Okay. And this will show you from the almost the beginning of the pandemic, back in April of 2020. You'd see there was a massive drop, pretty consistent. And this was because of, as you articulated, Doug, sentences were being prolonged, reporting dates were being pushed out, prosecutions, were being postponed, and that helped get the number of inmates down. But everything, starting at the beginning of the Biden administration, started to go back to normal, and you can see we're back up to almost where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. By the way, what this orange line shows, that's the private prison population. And what's driving a lot of this growth is that the Biden administration on January 26th, 2021, decided to no longer re-up or renew the contracts for private prisons. So they've been slowly dwindling down and went from 14 private prisons to now there's only 4 left. And those numbers are continuing to decrease. But those inmates that are in the private prisons are being transferred over to BOP facilities. And that's part of the reason why we see such a quick increase. Another reason is for some reason, the federal criminal justice system is under this misapprehension that the pandemic is over and everything is fine. And so that's why things are kind of progressing back to normal.
Yeah. We need to disabuse them of those notions at every opportunity that we can. All right. Well, I think we're getting close to the end. This has been scary and astoundingly helpful. I also go back to that one chart you had with all the deaths, and the one number that was so heartbreaking to me was the suicides. And comparatively speaking, that's over 18 years, I know. But I'd be interested to see how that number changes during the pandemic, with what an inmate has to go through to be incarcerated during a time like this.
That's a very good point.
Keep an eye on that. That'll be our next podcast. So let's talk about, just when we thought it was safe to go back in the water, it's not safe because COVID's still very much a thing, which is obviously the takeaway of our time together. But now we have something new and special with a great name, and it's monkeypox. Tell me what I have to worry about now with regard to monkeypox.
Well, again,
we didn't have enough to worry about.
Right. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I'm a numbers guy.
Play one on TV.
I play one on TV. Yes. But from what I understand is we have already recorded more infections from monkeypox, which is it's a version of smallpox, which was eradicated back in the early 70s, I believe. It's a lesser version of smallpox, but it still can cause warts and welts on you. And it has anywhere from a 1 to 3% fatality rate or fatality ratio, meaning that 1 to 3 out of every people that get monkeypox will die from it, which is quite significant compared to something like influenza. And it's a little bit more deadly than COVID. But at any rate, monkeypox traditionally has never been seen or rarely seen outside of Africa. And within the past week, we have seen more cases of monkeypox outside of Africa than at any time, than taking all incidents of monkeypox since 1970. Add all those up, we've had more in the last week than any time since 1970 combined outside of Africa. And last I looked, it's been detected in at least 12 countries, including the United States. And it's spread, so far, we think, not aerosolized like COVID, but through closer contact, through actual touching or kissing or even sexual contact. But the problem is that while that might not spread very well, luckily, in the general population like COVID, it would spread perfectly well in a place like a prison or a school or a jail, anywhere where there's a confined population, where there's no social distancing possible. So what my big fear is, now that everything has become lax with COVID, at least at the BOP, and we have no idea how many people are infected right now with COVID, and the results of long COVID that many inmates are suffering now. It's only going to take a couple of prison guards to walk, corrections officers to come in, or a visitor even, to introduce monkeypox into some institution. And what's going on right now in the BOP is they're moving inmates around constantly, trying to make room for new inmates. As they're closing down the private prisons, and as the rate of prosecution and sentencing is starting to increase again, they're going to keep getting flooded in these institutions with inmates moving around. And now all it's going to take is 1 or 2 monkeypox introduced somewhere, especially at the Oklahoma Transfer Center, where many inmates go through when they're being moved around throughout the United States. And boom, now you're going to have it within a matter of days, all spread out through the United States in these prisons. And then each one of those little prisons, each one of those 192 institutions is a little Chernobyl for spreading monkeypox into the communities. And this is not speculation. This doesn't have to do with monkeypox, but with COVID. The ACLU did a study a year and a half ago where it estimated at the time that there were 100,000 more deaths as a result of transmission from prisons and jails into local communities that had been counted for. In other words, the point is that they were showing, it was a scientific study showing that the infectious diseases spreading within jails and prisons can easily spread out to surrounding communities and cause more outbreaks there. And that's my big fear, is what's going to happen with monkeypox. The best way to spread monkeypox is to get them in prisons in the United States. And unfortunately, we happen to have more prisons and more jails than any other country on earth. And so we're just primed again for another big, ugly outbreak. Yeah. If the BOP does not get its shit together and start doing randomized testing and start releasing more inmates, and this is going to be on judges too, to start granting more compassionate release to lower the number of inmates. That we got to get all these nuclear reactors. We got to get all those the level of a virus that's spreading with them down, so they're not going nuclear, so to speak, right? Yeah. So to get below that threshold. And one thing I'll add, Doug, is the commission should within the next few months finally have a quorum. Yeah. And I think the most important thing that they need to address and give their absolute undivided attention to immediately is 1B 1.13 and compassionate release, and start articulating reasons, including infectious diseases, because COVID's not going to go away anytime soon, and monkeypox might be here to stay too, and God knows what else is coming down the road next month. They need to start taking into consideration revising 1B1.3. And my humble suggestion would be, since we're still in this national emergency and because inmates are actually contributing to infections in communities, is reverse the burden of persuasion. Right now, the burden of persuasion to obtain compassionate release is on the inmate. The inmate must prove extraordinary and compelling reasons. Rather, I think what the commission must do is, once the inmate can establish some threshold facts, then it's up to the government to prove why the burden should be on the government, why this inmate should not be released. And there might be good reasons under 3553A, maybe dangerousness and all this other stuff. But if this inmate is not dangerous, this inmate is a first-time economic offender or a drug mule or something like that, and has little to no criminal history, get him out.
Yeah.
Because right now we are just, this is worse than having a criminal out. We're creating all these Chernobyls, these viral Chernobyls in all these communities throughout the United States, and we're not monitoring them. They're just running amok right now.
Yeah, if the real concern is public safety.
If the real concern is public safety, decarceration is the answer right now.
Amen to that. Well, that's a great place to wrap up. But I will say this, just on the monkeypox thing. If people are listening going, okay, monkey, I'm not worried, much to do about nothing. I want people to understand, when COVID was just a blip on the radar, I'm Facebook friends with Mark, and he's posting about this, and he's telling me your schools are going to be closed down by March, and basically everything that happened was Mark predicted, because he's looking at the science, he's looking at the statistics, the data. And so when Mark Allenbaugh talks about monkeypox as a potential real issue, people should listen. That's all I'm saying. So I want to say thank you for spending this hour or so. It was good. It was really good. And for those of you who were looking at the charts, you saw sentencingstats.com up in the upper left-hand corner. That is Mark's organization, his website. He's available to do all those amazing charts and draft your compassionate release motions and give you all the information you need to try to turn the tide, because that's what we need to do together. So I am Doug Passon. Thank you for tuning in. And just a reminder, this is Set for Sentencing. The official podcast is launching at the end of the month. So check it out right now on YouTube or all your major podcast platforms, and subscribe, because we're going to start pumping out this content on a weekly basis. And we think it's going to be really helpful to lawyers. It's going to be really helpful to people who are facing potential sentencing. And it's going to be really interesting to your average Joe who's just kind of into this whole true crime thing to begin with. So everybody, thank you for hanging out. Mark Allenbaugh, thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot, Doug.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.